Ahead of crunch climate talks in Glasgow, the United Nations says current commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions put the planet on track for a catastrophic average 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise this century. Just days before the summit, the UN's Environment Programme says plans to reduce carbon pollution amounted to weak promises not yet delivered. We have more in this report.
Government will be in the spotlight at the COP26 conference next week to meet a deadline of this year to commit to more ambitious greenhouse gas cut promises in what could be the last chance to put the world on track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This would help prevent the worst imagined catastrophic changes threatening the planet, scientists say. As extreme weather events including superstorms, forest fires and floods increasingly hit countries around the world, even the slightest increase in global temperatures will worsen the situation, they say.
This COP needs to deliver. We know now from different reports, the latest one on the IPCC, the development report, show that we are in risk of missing the Paris Agreement, and we actually have in 13 years, we are going above 1.5 degrees if we don't improve what the world is doing.
We've seen almost all summer heat waves, fires, floods all over the world. So people are more and more aware of what climate change, how climate change can affect their lives directly. So there's a lot of support also within the Parliament to really go for the 1.5 degrees target.
We have almost all the technologies to go greener. And to go climate neutral. It's not only to go greener, it's to go climate neutral. But we need to change the rules of the game to make sure that all the good technologies, the zero carbon technologies, can be deployed massively at speed. And that's the core of the Green Deal. That's why we are changing the rules right now on carbon pricing, on industry, on cars, on energy, and so on and so on and so on. It's brand new.
The UN World Meteorological Organization said ahead of the two-week event, which begins on Sunday, that greenhouse gas concentrations hit a record last year and the world is way off track in capping rising temperatures. European Union politicians feel that the bloc is going to the United Nations Climate Summit having done its homework. The climate law, a roster of 54 legal acts to transform a wide range of industries with the aim of reaching climate neutrality by 2050 is being drafted and a climate deal in place.
The science is telling us that yes, it's not like we will have some climate change in the future. We're in the middle of it. Certain things, yes, already happened, and it is a high likelihood that they will not be reversible or not in our lifetimes. So now we're actually playing a catch-up game. So while people are thinking about I have to pay the price now, we have to actually, and that's our job, speed up the legislation and include mechanisms that will compensate people.
We need to make sure that people become sustainable without actually thinking about it too much. So if the way you move from city to city, if the most affordable way is also the most sustainable way, people will become sustainable automatically. If isolating your house is very smart from a gas bill perspective, people will choose that option.
We have seen the floods over summer in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands. We see in Spain, Portugal, these big fires killing forests, but also endangering people's lives. What we see here is just a small bit of what people expect in other parts of the world.
If all pledges by 192 countries under the Paris Agreement are taken together, an increase of about 16% in global emissions is expected by 2030 compared with 2010, which would lead to warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, a figure where life on Earth will be devastating for millions of people.
Environmental activist Unimo Basi joins us for more ahead the Climate Change Summit, especially as the world faces 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise. Good to have you join us, Unimo Basi.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be with you.
So the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described this as another thundering wake-up call. But one wonders if we have not had enough wake-up calls, especially when you look at what's going on around in terms of the extreme weather, extreme temperature. How many wake-up calls do we need at this point?
You said it very well, because we've had too many wake-up calls. It's difficult to awaken a man that is pretending to be asleep. This is just the problem we're having, because the 2.7, the idea of possibly having 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial level is suicidal for Africa and for much of the world. And so this is really a climate emergency. We're not having climate change anymore. This is climate emergency. And the politicians and leaders across the world need to wake up to this reality.
So just to look at a part of that report, which says that the plans to cut greenhouse gas emissions, what we currently have in terms of commitment is about 7.5% in 2030. But what we need is 55% cuts, which means that we will need about 7 times more what we currently have. How feasible is that, especially when you look at poorer countries and the need for funding in those countries?
It may look difficult, but I think if we consider this to be an emergency, it's about the survival of the human race, survival of living beings on the planet. So there's nothing that is too much to do if we were to avoid the catastrophe. Now, the world is busy. The climate COP is going to meet next week, and they will talk about molecules of carbon dioxide in the air, and then countries are not ready to slow down the use of carbon to the fossil fuel. They're not ready to shift away from the use of fossil fuel. All the agencies, scientists have said that we cannot afford to extract and burn up to 60 to 80% of known reserves of fossil fuels have to be left in the ground if we are to avoid anything beyond 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, which is already too high for Nigeria, too high for Africa. And so as long as nations are still investing in looking for more carbon to burn, more fossil fuels to burn, and they're talking about cutting emissions, they just run around in circles, not ready to do what needs to be done. The pattern for this has been set for many years. And so the meeting to discuss yearly is almost like a routine, a way of kicking the ball or kicking the can down the street, making a lot of noise rather than taking real action.
And just to buttress your point, because this is really about leaders not taking responsibility. For example, we see a country like Australia, which is the leading gas supplier in the world, not making enough commitments as well. Australia is saying it's going to have net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but this will not include its fossil fuel sector. What does that tell you about, projections ahead of the COP26 summit?
Well, the COP would not come up with anything meaningful. Just like the Paris Agreement itself cannot solve the climate problem because it's based on voluntary emission reduction. So countries like Australia, like Japan, like United States, like UK, they can afford to do what is convenient, what is politically expedient for their leaders. They're not ready to go deep. Even the discussion, it's become common knowledge or common thing to say in conversation about net zero. Net zero doesn't really mean cutting emissions. It means you keep emitting, but you have a way of showing that there's another means of mitigating the amount of carbon that you are emitting. If the carbon capture and storage technologies, they are not really feasible, they are not available, they cannot do anything in the short term. And we don't really see the long-term investment in tackling the problem. It's really very alarming to see that despite the amount of climate crisis we're already seeing, the floods, the fires, and all the other problems, the desertification and the droughts that we're seeing already at 1.1 degrees temperature increase, we can even talk about 2 degrees. 2 degrees is suicidal, as I said. 2.7 is completely out of this world. And so as long as the COP remains a venue for avoiding climate action, unfortunately, they come up with nice language, they slap each other's back, but the world will keep on burning and people will keep on drowning, unfortunately.
Mr. Bassi, we have 8 years to tackle what the UN has tagged a climate catastrophe. Just 8 years. And with this kind of emissions, Can we still make the turning point, and what should we be doing in these 8 years?
I think there's still a chance of doing something. Politicians can be forced to take the hard decisions. We are seeing children on the streets avoiding school, striking on Fridays in many parts of the world, the Fridays for the Future, and other young people. The young people should be really worried about their future. Most of the decision makers currently don't worry too much about the long term. But they talk about net zero in 2050. They're thinking about climate action in 20 years, in 40 years. But as you said, 8 years is such a small stretch of time. This is a time to lay aside all the pretenses and look at the future of our children and just do what needs to be done. Keep fossil fuels in the ground. Stop searching for more oil. Stop searching for more gas. Stop searching for more coal, and make your plan to manage the decline, to move away. The rich countries who have polluted the atmosphere, taken up the carbon budget, should cut as quickly as possible. Poorer nations, more vulnerable nations who never really contributed to the problem can have the 8 years to slowly transit away from dependence on fossil fuels. Unless we face this hard fact, this hard truth, I'm sorry to say that it's going to be a matter of who will survive.
And this is perhaps why we should get children more involved, educate children and get youth more involved, and not leave it for the leaders alone. Thank you. It's always Absolutely. Great to have your insight on issues like this. Environmental activist in Nibobasi.
Thank you.